Welcome to Sabbath School Daily, where we have been studying from this lesson, Psalms. This week we have studied from lesson number 10, which has the title Lessons of the Past, and today is Final Thought Friday, where we come together, look at the quotes that are mentioned in today's lesson, look at the questions that you should bring answered to your Sabbath School discussion group tomorrow at church, and conclude the study of this week. The first quote that appears here in today's lesson is really the paragraph that I found that truly sums up what we've studied and talked about this week quite perfectly. It says, "The historical Psalms are a powerful witness to God's fidelity to his people. Each event in the history of God's people was a providential step leading toward the final fulfillment of the divine promise of the world's Savior in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. Even the trials, which often perplexed God's people and made them think that God had abandoned them, were under God's sovereign control and part of his providence because God is the supreme Lord of history. The psalmist skillfully presents the truth that even the people's disloyalty cannot prevent God from keeping faith to his people and fulfilling his promises. However, the unrepentant individuals and groups were excluded from the covenantal blessings, and their infamous end serves as a lasting warning of how life without or opposed to God destroys people." The fascinating part of this week's study to me was the fulfillment of God's covenant to his people throughout their life, throughout the history of the children of Israel. Because what we see in the Psalms that we studied were, first of all, the power and glory and majesty of God, his faithfulness, his forgiveness, his mercy and compassion. On the other side, we studied some people, we read through some people that were faithful, that while they did have hiccups and mistakes and they fell down sometimes, these were people that strived to live godly lives. And in their lives, the Lord was able to act, not only for their own benefit, but for the benefit, for the grace of those around them as well. And then you'll have the stories of those who did not walk in the ways of the Lord, who fell short, and yet God still extended mercy and love and forgiveness should they want it. So we had examples of those who rejected God's love. We had the examples of those who fell down, who made mistakes, especially in the story of the children of Israel, who constantly had ups and downs, who went up, towards a good relationship with the Lord and then fell back down into idolatry, spiritual adultery, and so on and so forth. And what we see throughout all of this is that while the Lord does feel hurt, while God does declare himself to be a jealous God, and who wouldn't be? Right? That's why the Bible describes God as the bridegroom and the church as his bride. Who wouldn't be righteously jealous if the bride were out committing adultery and betraying them and speaking behind their back and doing everything that goes against loyalty to a loved one? Of course, God describes himself as that jealous groom. And so we see that constantly, that up and down in the life of the children of Israel, and all of these Psalms speaking about those historical moments where these things happened. The true main character in all these stories, however, is not the children of Israel. It's God and how he loved them and how he extended mercy and forgiveness and transformation to them. So always remember that behind the stories of the Bible, the main character aren't the human counterparts, but God, who is revealing himself in how he acts in the life of humans. The lesson then includes a quote that comes from the book Life Sketches of Ellen White, and it comes from page 196, and it says, "We have nothing to fear for the future except as we shall forget the way that the Lord has led us and his teaching in our past history." That's the value of studying these stories that happen in the Bible that teaches what God is like, who he is, and how he acts. Once we understand that, we can confidently walk towards the future. The lesson then includes a piece of advice given by the same author, Ellen White, and the author of the lesson words it this way. She says, "For God's people to go forward fearlessly, they need to know the facts of their history." Ellen G. White advises believers to read Psalms 105 and 106 at least once every week. And that appears in Testimonies to Ministers and Gospel Workers, page 98. Friends, reading the Bible, especially some specific portions of the Bible that remind us of who God is, that remind us the way that he deals with human beings, that remind us his goodness, love, and the vindication of his people, that goes a long way into encouraging us. Because look, I'll tell you, we go through a lot here in this world. Some of us go through more than others. And for those who are going through a lot, the only way to remain strong in the Lord is by keeping yourself close to the Lord. Now, I know that's easier said than done. I know that sometimes you feel so weak, so tired, so anxious, so frustrated with life that you don't want to do anything except crawl under the covers of bed and never leave. But the Lord has promised that he will answer those who reach out to him. And so my advice, my encouragement to you is constantly reach out. Constantly study the God of the Bible. Learn about him, learn from him, and that will strengthen you in your day-to-day. The lesson then ends by including 3 questions. I'm going to read it out to you. I want you to think about them. I'm not really going to propose any answers, but I might say one thing or another about them. The first question is, what are the blessings of remembering God's faithful leading of his people in history? What are the consequences of forgetting or ignoring the lessons of the past? How can we apply that same principle to us as a church called to do the same thing that ancient Israel has been called to do? So I think that a great way to go about this question is by reading the previous quote that was already mentioned that says, "We have nothing to fear for the future except as we shall forget the way the Lord has led us and is teaching in our past history." So that's the value of applying the past to our life today. The second question is, how do the Psalms encourage us to recognize God's providential care in our life and to exercise patience and trust in God's sovereign ways, even when it's not easy to understand why things are happening as they are? Dwelling in the silence of God is one of the most difficult things for anyone. When we are called to exercise patience, going through the storm, but that's truly where we grow. And so that's where I would go if I were considering answering this question in the group setting at church. And finally, the third question is, how can we make the study of the history of God's people more prominent in our personal and communal worship services? How can we be more intentional in telling our children about the more recent history of God's people? I would say that the answer to this question is first knowing the history. If you don't know the history of God's people, if you don't know the history of God's more recent people, then how are you going to apply it? So the first thing is know it, and then you are able to apply it where it fits in your everyday life. Please remember to study your lesson. This week's lesson was incredible. I loved studying it. It was full of historical quotes and historical moments. And so going through that, it really grows us, it really educates us and establishes us in order to work for the Lord. Please remember to comment down below. I love hearing from you. And also remember to like, to share, and to subscribe to our videos. We release one every day. And I hope to see you again here tomorrow for another Sabbath School Daily.